Hey guys, and welcome to another video review with your host, Ben Hall, back again with BXB. This time I'm going to be talking about Far Cry Primal. But let me just first of all start off with my love of the Far Cry series and my history of it. I remember playing the original PC game in 2004, developed by Crytek, and marveling at the draw distances and how it, pushed the boundaries of an open world first-person shooter. It was really the first first-person shooter to do that. And then after that, Crytek left the Far Cry franchise behind to move on to the games such as Crysis, and Ubisoft took over with the somewhat controversial Far Cry 2. It basically was the beginning of the Far Cry formula, with the introduction of enigmatic villains, the open world as we know it, and emergent gameplay based around things like the fire mechanics. Some people are not a fan of Far Cry 2. It definitely had some issues. The malaria mechanic was a little bit hard to get along with. Then came along Far Cry 3. Now that one was a real trendsetter for me. I absolutely adored Far Cry 3 and getting back to the island setting of the original, though not exactly the same, obviously. The villains in that what really stood the game apart. Far Cry 4 came along. I was less impressed. Far Cry 4 was an odd experience for me because it felt so similar to the third one that it just didn't excite me in the same way. In many ways it was more polished, but it also suffered from the Ubisoft sort of problem of let's fill that open world map with just so much stuff to do, and it was just bewildering in places. And then between Far Cry 3 and 4, as well as some earlier sort of spin-off games, we had the experimental Blood Dragon, which was like a DLC arcade game release. That one was something else. So an 80s inspired neon cyberpunk world. I absolutely adored Blood Dragon, actually. It was a really cool idea, really well executed. And that then brings us up to date with Far Cry Primal. Now the basic premise of Far Cry Primal was it's 10,000 BC, and it's to do, with cavemen and the things they get up to with survival and tribal wars and animals and all that kind of stuff. An interesting concept, much like I thought the Blood Dragon concept was interesting and set itself apart from the more modern day setting of Far Cry games that it usually inhabit. So let's, without further ado, cut to the footage and I will deep dive into my thoughts on Far Cry Primal. Without a shadow of a doubt, and much to my disappointment, Ubisoft still suffers from the problem of let's fill the map with lots of crap to do that nobody really cares about and isn't particularly interesting in Far Cry Primal. And as you explore more of the world and discover more things, the map gets more and more filled with those icons that just They do the opposite of it make me want to play the game. They just bewildering. You just look at them and you think, oh man, more sort of busybody stuff to do, and it's not interesting most of the time. But I don't want to dwell too much on that. Let's talk about one of the things that Far Cry Primal does that is really cool, and that is let you be the Beastmaster. No, not the awful 80s film, but in some ways a very similar comparison to that. You get to basically capture and collect a whole different bunch of sort of period-specific animals and critters, including badgers. Badgers are very important to the Far Cry universe. My favourite one, by far, was the saber-toothed tiger. Now, the cool thing about the saber-toothed tiger, and one of the bears as well, is that once you've got them captured, and once you've got them working for you, you can ride them. Now, running around this open world on the back of a saber-toothed tiger, launching myself and mauling enemies is a lot of fun. And in many ways, it helps me overlook some of the other shortcomings of Far Cry Primal, just because I had so much fun doing this. It's engaging, it's hilarious, and it's a pretty unique experience to the Far Cry universe, and to any first-person shooter. It's really, really good fun. Now, on top of the problems with the map and just the amount of crap that's poured over it, the concept of Far Cry Primal is basically you're this caveman, and the big difference is that because you haven't got a world filled with guns and an economy and money and things like that, instead you have to scavenge and craft everything. So you're constantly walking around, picking up wood and rocks and checking every body for stuff and hunting and taking all the pelts you can and all the meat you can, because that's the basic sort of building blocks of everything you do in Far Cry Primal. Because there's no money and there's no sort of economy, everything is dependent on that. And it basically makes Far Cry a crafting sort of survival light game. It's not exactly the most fun thing in the world. And because everything else is minimalized so much due to the setting, it becomes the crux of the entire game. and it's a kind of a big world and a big game. It almost feels because, you know, Ubisoft decided to make this a full price release. Unlike Blood Dragon, which was a great experience. It had a very sort of unique idea and concept, and it was focused, and it was also an arcade priced game at the time. I think about £20, something like that, instead of the £40 to £50 of Far Cry Primal. And I just feel like the idea of Far Cry Primal would have been more suited to a more focused, tighter experience. Instead of strung out over this big open world, it just makes the whole sort of content offering feel thin and lacking in many ways, even if the world is still covered on the map with icons of things to do that are of little importance and of little interest. On top of that, there's very little story in the Far Cry Primal. I found that the characters were very kind of by-the-numbers caveman, me Tarzan, you Jane kind of insulting language. It didn't feel that well thought out. Considering all the story is conveyed via subtitles because they created an entirely new language for the prehistoric man that we're dealing with here in Far Cry Primal, the language sounded awesome, a lot of the deliveries were great, but the actual story that was conveyed via the subtitles felt very, very thin. Basically, you're trying to survive, build your tribe back up while you compete with 2 other tribes. Now, the one thing about the other tribes is they're not that interesting. There are the cannibals and the fire guys. Now, you get to sort of realize over time that there is a bit of variety to them due to, you know, as you get to the harder enemies, they get tougher, they get more armor, they do more damage. But really, at the sort of the end of the day, they're quite simplistic. They're not that exciting to fight. The most exciting stuff to deal with in Far Cry Primal, without a shadow of a doubt, is the wildlife. Now, you do feel vulnerable at pretty much all times, and therefore, you know, you're dealing with like these crazy animals, tigers, you name it, lions, mammoths, wolves, everything you can imagine, and you know, in that time period, being an adversary to man is there, and it makes your life pretty damn difficult. But like I said, there are many redeeming factors to Far Cry Primal, to be honest. And as I played the game more, I enjoyed the beast taming aspect that much more as well. Riding those animals is really a high point of the game. Like I said, in addition to the saber-tooth, I was able to ride bears and mammoths and all that sort of stuff. And it really adds a little bit of variety to how you deal with the enemies. Much like previous Far Cry games, Far Cry Primal has that similar sort of structure of outposts and fortresses and things like that you have to capture to continue your influence throughout the land. Basically, it comes down to the fact of, do you enjoy the Far Cry formula? Because while the crafting aspect has really taken dominance in Far Cry Primal, the formula is still somewhat similar. It's that idea of kind of emergent gameplay, creating your own fun, and expanding your influence throughout the world. That's definitely still a big factor. One other thing that the setting has made possible, and also is slightly to its detriment, is that there's a lot less variety in weapons in Far Cry Primal. By far, the most unique one that I had the most fun with was the spear. Now, the spear you can use either like you're holding it and you can just jab it at enemies when they get close. It doesn't do a lot of damage, but at range the thing carries a real weight to it. When you throw it and you see it sort of slam into an enemy, knock him back, knock him over a cliff or something like that, it feels like it's a weapon with a real effectiveness. But saying that, the weapon I used the most was the bow and arrow. The good old bow and arrow that Far Cry, throughout the series, ever since, really in number 3 it became a big deal, but there was a crossbow in number 2 as well. But, you know, Ubisoft's and their bow tech, they're on point. And it feels like a lot of fun, you know, stealthing around and picking your moments. That's something else that's worth mentioning. Due to the setting and the vulnerability of the player in Far Cry, you definitely find yourself playing it more as a stealth game. Overt action is definitely a last resort, and the good thing is that once you do have a decent pet animal that's working as your sort of buddy, your compatriot and your backup in any experience, it makes the ability to go in guns blazing a little bit easier. But due to the kind of weapons you are using in Far Cry, it's definitely not your first choice. You're just going to get badly killed every time if you don't sort of think about the smart way of taking down your opponents and clearing the bases and clearing the fortresses first. So all in all, I enjoyed my time with Far Cry. I still doesn't have that special bit of fun that Far Cry 3 and then Blood Dragon had for me. I still feel like Ubisoft needs to freshen up the formula a little bit. But if you enjoy that formula, and if you don't feel the need to be necessarily challenged in new ways, and you're just looking for more Far Cry, the new setting does add a certain amount of fun, even if it doesn't feel 100% as fresh as, say, Blood Dragon did. So I think it's fair to say that I enjoyed my time, but it's not the best the Far Cry series has to offer. I would score it 7 out of 10.